December 2nd, 1993, the day after my birthday. I am barefoot on a rooftop in Medellín, the city I owned, the city I loved, the city that is now hunting me like a dog through its own streets. I can hear them below. I can hear the boots, the radios, the voices of men who want to be the ones who say they killed me. They put my face on t-shirts. They made a Netflix series about me. Tourists visit my zoo. My hippos have become a conservation crisis. I am, 20 years after my death, more famous than most presidents, most generals, most saints. I built an empire in blood and cocaine, and it has outlasted me in ways I never imagined. This is what that cost. All of it. In my own words. Before the cocaine, before the bombs, before the newspaper headlines and the wanted posters and the American government and the search block and all the rest of it, there was a boy. A boy from a mountain town called Rio Negro, who moved to the edges of Medellín and watched the city from the outside and decided, with a certainty that never left him, that he would not stay on the outside forever. My father was a farmer, Abel de Jesus Escobar. A good man in the way that quiet men are good. He worked, he didn't complain, he didn't ask for more than the land offered. He accepted his position in the world. I watched him accept it. And I decided, very young, that acceptance was a form of surrender. My mother was different. Hermilda, mi mamá. She was a school teacher, and she looked at me, the third of her 7 children, with a certainty that was almost frightening. She believed I was meant for something large. She never stopped believing that. Not when the newspapers called me a monster, not when the government called me a terrorist, not when the whole world had decided what I was. My mother looked at her son and saw greatness. The world looked at me and eventually agreed, though not in the way either of us had imagined. Medellín in the 1950s and 60s. You have to understand what this city was, what it smelled like, what it felt like, to understand what I became. Colombia had just finished tearing itself apart. La violencia, they called it. 200,000 dead in a decade of civil war between liberals and conservatives, and none of those people, not one, was rich. The rich people arranged the violence. Poor people supplied the bodies. The displaced came to Medellín by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. They built houses on the hillsides from whatever they could find, tin, wood, prayer. They stacked poverty on top of poverty and called it a neighborhood. I grew up at the edge of all of that. Not the worst of it, but close enough to smell it. Close enough to understand the only thing I needed to understand about the world I was born into. The rules were written by people who had decided that people like me did not get to win. I was a good student. People forget that. They look at what I became and they assume I was always the devil, that I came into the world already broken. I was not broken. I was watching. I watched which boys got everything without effort. I watched how the wealthy families of Bogotá, the cachacos, the elite, looked at people from Medellín, from Antioquia, from the mountains, with that particular expression. Slightly raised chin, eyes that looked through you rather than at you. I decided then, they would look at me eventually. One way or another, they would see me. I told a friend when I was 15 years old that I wanted to be big, that I would either be elected president or I would get there the other way. I was 15 years old. I already knew which way it would be. The first things I stole were tombstones. I know, even now it sounds absurd. A teenage boy sandblasting names of cemetery stones and selling them clean to families who couldn't afford new ones. But here is what that small crime taught me. And this is the lesson I carried for the rest of my life. Every system has a gap between what it pretends to be and what it actually is. Find the gap. Operate in the gap. The formal economy pretended everyone had equal access to it. They did not. I operated in the gap. The law pretended to be equally applied. It was not. I operated in the gap. Politicians pretended to serve the public. They served themselves. I operated in the gap. And eventually, I became the gap. From stolen tombstones, I moved to stolen cars. From stolen cars to contraband, cigarettes, electronics, whiskey, moving across borders without paying the state its tribute. I was good at this. I was very good at this. I also learned violence. This is the part people want me to apologize for. This is where you expect me to say I regret it, that I was young and afraid and didn't know better. And perhaps some of that is true, but here is the deeper truth. Violence in the world I grew up in was not an aberration. It was the language of the streets, the language of the powerful, the language Colombia had been speaking since before I was born. I did not invent that language. I simply became fluent. By my early 20s, I was running with the serious men, kidnappers, extortionists, men who understood that in a country where the state couldn't protect you, the only protection that meant anything was the kind you arranged for yourself. I was not afraid. This surprised people. Men older and harder than me would watch me in tense moments, and they would see something in my face, or rather, they would not see something that should have been there. Fear. I did not feel it the way other men did. This was either my greatest strength or my deepest flaw. Probably both. And then, cocaine. In the mid-1970, cocaine was a whisper, a luxury. Rich Americans paying fortunes for a product that cost almost nothing to produce. The margin between what it cost to make and what someone in Miami would pay for it, that margin was the most extraordinary economic opportunity in the history of crime. I looked at that margin, and I saw not just money, I saw architecture. I saw a system that could be built, a supply chain, a logistics operation, a corporation, the most profitable corporation in the history of the world, operating in the one market no government could tax or regulate because they had decided to pretend it didn't exist. While other traffickers fought each other over scraps, I was thinking about market share. While they were arguing over individual shipments, I was designing a supply chain that would eventually move 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every single day. Every single day. I was 26 years old. I had never taken a business class. I had never read an economics textbook. But I understood one thing no professor could have taught me. The biggest business opportunity of the 20th century was sitting right there. Unharvested, unorganized, waiting. All it required was someone ruthless enough, ambitious enough, and smart enough to build it. I was all three. Let me tell you how you build an empire. You don't begin with power, you begin with organization. Everyone else in the cocaine trade in the late 1970s was thinking small. Individual shipments, individual relationships, small groups of men protecting small pieces of territory and killing each other constantly over nothing. I went to the Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, Fabio, wealthy family, horses, legitimate business, all Medellín money. They had distribution connections. I had operational infrastructure. Together with Carlos Leda and Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, El Mexicano, we sat at a table and we asked a question that no one in the Colombian underworld had ever thought to ask seriously before. What if we stopped competing and started cooperating? The Medellín cartel. That is what the newspapers would eventually call what we built. The name makes it sound organized, formal, with bylaws and committees. It was not quite that. It was a network. A web of mutual interest, shared risk, and understood consequences. The consequence of betrayal was death. The benefit of loyalty was unimaginable wealth. Simple, effective, durable. I controlled everything. That was my innovation. The thing the textbooks on organized crime eventually called vertical integration, though I never used that phrase. I simply understood that every link in the chain was a vulnerability. So I owned every link. The pasta came from Peru and Bolivia, the raw material, the coca leaf pressed into paste. I built laboratories in the jungle to process it. I controlled the airstrips. I ran pilots. I owned routes through the Caribbean and the Bahamas. Carlos later had an island, Norman's Key, that he turned into a refueling station for my aircraft flying into Florida. I had contacts inside customs, inside the police, inside the government. By 1982, Forbes magazine put my net worth at $2 billion. By the mid-1980, I was generating more than $400 million per week. I had so much money that I couldn't spend it fast enough to keep up with what was coming in. I spent $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to bundle the bills. I buried money in fields. I stored it in warehouses. The rats ate millions in the walls. It didn't matter. And when my daughter was cold and afraid, hiding in the mountains with me during the worst of the war against the state, I burned $2 million in cash to keep my family warm. Do you understand me now? That is not the story of a monster. That is the story of a father. Both things were true. I was both of those things, always, at the same time. Hacienda Nápoles, my monument, my declaration. 7,000 acres in the Magdalena Medio, and I filled it with everything I had ever been told people like me could not have. Hippos, giraffes, elephants. I brought the world to Colombia. I brought Africa to Colombia and put it on my land because I could. I built lakes. I built a go-kart track for my children. I built a replica of a Spanish village. I mounted the first plane I used to smuggle cocaine above the entrance gate like a trophy above a fireplace. Because it was a trophy. Because I had won. But I didn't disappear into that palace. I went back to the comunas, to the neighborhoods where the boys had nothing and the streets smelled of garbage and poverty. I built them houses. More than 400 homes in Moravia alone, an entire neighborhood that had been built on top of a garbage dump. I built soccer fields, I built schools, and they loved me for it. They called me El Patron. They put photographs of me on their walls. When I drove through the comunas, they came to the streets. Children. People ask me, was it cynical? Was the generosity calculated? Some of it. Of course, some of it was. I needed loyalty. I needed a sea of civilian protection that police and soldiers could not penetrate. I needed the poor of Medellín to be on my side. But some of it was not calculated at all. Some of it was a boy from Envigado who still remembered what it felt like to watch other people have everything while you had nothing. Who hadn't forgotten the expression on the face of the Cachaco elite when they looked at people from our mountains. Some of it was rage and love braided so tightly together I could no longer tell them apart. But I am getting ahead of myself, because before the full war came, before the bombs and the judges and the presidential candidates and the years of blood, there was one moment when I tried to do it legitimately. One moment when I still believed I could be the man my mother always thought I was. I ran for Congress. The Liberal Party. an alternate congressional seat representing Medellín. I wore a suit. I gave speeches about poverty, about housing, about the people in the comunas who had no representation, no voice in Bogotá's marble halls. The people I had come from, the people I had fed and housed and whose children played on fields I had built. And the truth is, I was not wrong about any of it. Everything I said about inequality, about the oligarchy, about the corruption of Colombia's elite class, it was true. Every word. The cachacos who ran Colombia had been stealing from ordinary Colombians for generations. They had simply learned to do it with a suit and a briefcase instead of a gun. The difference between them and me was not their virtue, it was their paperwork. But I had a practical reason too. Of course I did. The United States was pressuring Colombia to sign an extradition treaty. An American prison? That was the one place my money could not reach me. The one outcome I genuinely feared. A congressional seat meant legal immunity from prosecution. Plata had not just two meanings. It had 100 uses. And then, he appeared. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, Colombia's justice minister. Young, brilliant, honest, genuinely, infuriatingly honest. The kind of man who looks at corruption and does not calculate what it's worth to look away. The kind of man who simply doesn't. He stood up in Congress and he said my name. He showed my criminal record, my arrest history. He exposed to the whole of Colombia, in the country's legislative chamber, exactly who Pablo Escobar was. I sat there. He stripped me of my immunity. He forced my resignation. He launched the most aggressive anti-narcotics campaign the country had seen, and he moved to make the extradition treaty real, to make it enforceable, to open the door to the one courtroom I could not control. He was doing his job. He was very, very good at his job. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was 36 years old on April 30, 1984. He was shot dead in his car on a Bogotá street. My men, my order. I want to tell you that I hesitated, that there was a night of doubt, a morning of second thoughts. I want to give you a version of this moment that is more human, more conflicted. I cannot. What I can tell you is this. In that moment, I had calculated that Lara Bonilla alive was a greater threat to my existence than the consequences of his death. I was wrong. Not morally wrong. I knew I was morally wrong. I had simply decided that morality was a luxury I could not afford. I was strategically wrong. Because Rodrigo Lara Bonilla's death did not end the threat to me. It unified Colombia against me. It transformed me overnight from a powerful criminal into a declared enemy of the state. It was the first of my great miscalculations. It would not be the last. I fled to Panama, then Nicaragua, then back to Colombia, moving constantly. President Betancourt declared me a national emergency. The war had begun. I had started it. And some part of me, the part that is still, even now, honest with itself, knew even then that this was a war I would eventually lose. But I pushed that knowledge down, and I went to war anyway. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, a bribe or a bullet. That is what they say I offered everyone. And it's true, that was the offer. But let me explain to you what that phrase actually meant. Because it is more philosophical than it sounds. It meant, I understand how the world works. I understand that everyone has a price. Everyone. The police officer, the judge, the politician, the general. The question is never whether they can be moved. The question is only how. Some men move for money. Others move only when the alternative is their children's lives. I could work with either motivation. I bribed Colombia's police. I bribed its judges. I bribed members of its Congress. I bribed military officers. I bribed customs officials, airport workers, politicians at every level. The ones I could not bribe, I killed. It was not personal. I want you to understand that. It was never personal in the way people imagine. It was operational. A man who cannot be moved with money and who insists on doing his job is, from my perspective, simply an obstacle that requires a different solution. I am not asking for your understanding. I am asking for your comprehension of the logic. I also built an army. My sicarios, my assassins. They came from the comunas. Boys 16, 17, 18 years old who had no school, no future, no prospect. I gave them motorcycles. I gave them weapons. I gave them $300 for every police officer they killed, and they lined up for the work. Think about that. Not the horror of it. I know you see the horror. Think about why it was possible. Think about what kind of society creates teenage boys for whom that offer is the best economic opportunity available. I did not manufacture those boys. Colombia manufactured those boys. I merely hired them. By the late 1980, police officers were dying in Medellín at a rate of several per week. The murder rate in the city reached a number so extraordinary that statisticians noted it was higher than any active conventional war zone in the world at that time. I was at war with my own city, with my own country. And yet, every night, in whatever safe house or jungle camp I was hiding in, I called my children. I read to them over the phone. My son Juan Pablo was growing up without his father present, and I called him every night without fail. I burned walls during the day, and at night, I was just a father who missed his children. Both things were true. Both things are still true. M-19, a guerrilla organization with whom I had a complex and disputed relationship. Some say I funded the operation. I will not confirm or deny, even now. Seized the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, took hostages, demanded the burning of the extradition treaty. The Colombian army stormed the building. 98 people died. 11 of Colombia's 25 Supreme Court justices were killed. The extradition files, those physical documents the army was ordered to recover, burned in the fire. The extradition cases against me were gone. I was, temporarily, legally safer. Colombia was on its knees. His name was Carlos Galán. And if there is one decision, one moment where I look back across everything I did and I feel something close to what other people call regret, it is him. Not because killing him was wrong in a way my other killings were not. I know they were all wrong. I am not constructing a moral hierarchy here. I say Galán because he was the one who sealed me. He was the one whose death made my own inevitable. Galán was everything Colombia's oligarchy pretended to be but wasn't. Genuinely honest, genuinely capable, genuinely committed to a Colombia that was better than the one we all lived in. He had rejected my money years earlier. He had made the eradication of narco-corruption the center of his presidential campaign. He was going to win the election. And then he was going to extradite me. On August 18, 1989, before thousands of people in the middle of a rally in Soacha, my men killed him. He was 43 years old. He had a wife, 2 sons. What I did not understand, what my arrogance prevented me from understanding, was this. Killing a judge is a crime. Killing a police officer is a crime. They generate outrage. They generate response. Killing Luis Carlos Galán was different. Galán was Colombia's hope. He was a living embodiment of the possibility that the country could be better. And when I killed him, I killed the hope. And a country without hope is a country with nothing left to lose. Colombia declared war on me. Not the careful, measured, corruption-riddled enforcement of before. Total war. President Barco, the military, the DEA, the CIA, the full weight of everything aligned against one man. And from that moment, I was already losing, whether I knew it or not. I kept fighting. Of course I kept fighting. I bombed the DAS headquarters. 52 dead, more than 1,000 wounded. I bombed the El Espectador newspaper. I bombed shopping centers. I placed a bomb on Avianca Flight 203, trying to kill a single government informant I believed was aboard. He was not on the plane. 107 passengers were. I have not said the word regret in this account. I will not begin now. But I will say this. That plane did not move me toward winning. Nothing I bombed moved me toward winning. All of it. Every death, every device, every act of terror was force applied in the wrong direction, driving the world further from any outcome I could survive. Violence had been my greatest tool. Now, it was becoming my prison. La Catedral. In 1991, I negotiated a surrender with the government of President Cesar Gaviria. I would serve time. I would go to prison. The killing would stop, or slow at least, and Colombia could breathe. In exchange, I chose the land. I chose the location. I approved the staff. I would not be extradited. What I built on that mountaintop near Envigado was, in every meaningful sense, not a prison. Soccer field, a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall. I had a waterfall built inside my prison. A discotheque, guest quarters, a dollhouse for my daughter. I received visitors. I held meetings. I continued to make decisions about my business from inside the walls of my state-issued confinement. And the Colombian government knew, or suspected, or chose not to look too closely. Plata o Plomo, even when the plata is implicit. But then I made a mistake. I had two associates brought to La Catedral, Gerardo Moncada and Fernando Galeano, men who had been stealing from me, siphoning money from the cartel's operations. They were brought inside my prison, and I had them killed there. The Colombian government could not ignore this. There were murders happening inside the prison they were nominally operating. They announced I would be transferred to a conventional facility. July 22nd, 1992. They came to transfer me. I walked out, through the fence, into the Colombian fog. While government officials, apparently uncertain which direction the facility even faced in the mountain mist, tried to organize themselves. I was free. And free this time meant hunted. Because now there was no deal, no negotiation, no La Catedral awaiting the next surrender. Now there was only one resolution possible. And somewhere in Bogotá, in Cali, in Washington, D.C., men who had been waiting for exactly this moment began making phone calls. In the last year of my life, I lived like the people I grew up among. No Hacienda Nápoles, no discotheque, no zoo. A series of middle-class houses in ordinary Medellín neighborhoods, moving constantly, every few weeks, because staying anywhere longer than that was death. I had enemies everywhere now. The Colombian search block, elite military and police units trained specifically and solely to find me. The DEA, the CIA, American Signals Intelligence Technology listening to every frequency in Medellín, waiting for me to speak. And los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar. People persecuted by Pablo Escobar, my former allies, men I had wronged. The Cali cartel, my rivals who saw my weakness as their opportunity. Paramilitaries, families of people I had killed. They found each other in my shadow, and they became something organized and murderous and aimed at me. They burned my properties. They killed my lawyers. They went after the people closest to me. I could feel the net drawing tighter. But I kept calling my family. My son Juan Pablo, my daughter Manuela, my wife Maria Victoria. I called them every day. I needed to hear them. I needed, even as I was becoming a ghost, even as the world I had built was dismantling itself around me, to be a father. The Americans had a unit called Centra Spike, Signals Intelligence. Aircraft flying over Medellín triangulating radio transmissions. Every call I made, they were a little closer. They told me later, they told my family later, that they had narrowed my location several times, that I moved just before they had me, that I was perhaps more careful than even they expected. But I was also exhausted, and I was lonely in a way that is difficult to articulate, a loneliness that belongs specifically to powerful men brought low. I had been surrounded my entire adult life, by associates, by sicarios, by family, by the noise and movement of an empire. Now it was a succession of quiet rooms and a telephone. December 1st, 1993, my 44th birthday. I was alone in a house in Los Olivos, a middle-class neighborhood in Medellín. My family called. My mother called. I don't know if I felt it, that particular quality of endings, but I wonder sometimes whether some part of me knew, whether some part of me had always known that this was how it ended for men like me. Not in a palace, not in power, in a borrowed house, in an ordinary neighborhood, in the city I had never been able to leave. The next morning, December 2nd, they came. You know this part. Everyone knows this part. The gunfire, the rooftop, the barefoot men running across terracotta tile with Colombia below him and above him an open sky and nothing left. No deal to negotiate, no judge to bribe, no army to deploy. Just me and 3 bullets. 1 in the leg, 1 in the torso, 1 behind the ear. Whether that last bullet was fired by a Colombian officer or by my own hand, history has never settled the question. My son believes I killed myself. The Colombian government says I was killed in the crossfire. I will tell you only this. When you are the kind of man I was, there are certain indignities you simply do not accept. Make of that what you will. When the radio message went out, Viva Colombia, mató Escobar. Colombia celebrated. People danced in the streets. Police officers posed with my body in photographs that would circle the world. My family, in the hours before they were reached, turned on the television and saw what the television was calling a great victory. My son was 16 years old. My daughter was 8. They spent years afterward living under assumed names in foreign countries, carrying a last name they could not speak aloud. I am proud that Medellín survived me. I am ashamed that it had to. And I am something that I don't quite have a word for. Watching myself be romanticized by the world that condemned me. The television series, the documentaries, the tourists who visit Hacienda Nápoles, who pose at the entrance gate with the mounted plane behind them, the hippo's descendants swimming in the lake beyond. They made me a brand. They made me an aesthetic. Men in cities around the world wear my face on their t-shirts. Men who have never heard a gunshot, who will never know what it costs to be the thing my face on their shirt represents. I understand the fascination. I was fascinating. But I was also the reason Colombian police officers called their wives every morning and said goodbye properly, because they knew the day might be the day my sicarios found them. I was the reason Colombian judges wore bulletproof vests to their own courtrooms. I was the reason Luis Carlos Galan's sons grew up without their father. I was the reason 3,000 to 4,000 people who were alive before I made my choices are not alive today. Hold both things, the fascination and the cost. Hold both things, or you have understood nothing. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be seen. I wanted the world that had decided people like me didn't count to be forced to reckon with us. It reckoned with me. The whole world reckoned with me. Whether that was enough, whether any of it was worth what it cost, I leave that question to the world that made me and to the world I made.